Hello and welcome to Monocle on Culture. I'm Robert Bounds. Now, we talk about movie blockbusters and well-loved features a lot on this show, but what about the flops of Hollywood? Well, on today's programme, we're joined by Telegraph film critic and friend of the show, Tim Robey, who's released Box Office Poison, Hollywood's Story in a Century of Flops. From misunderstood debuts to disastrous sequels, Tim's book is an alternative telling of Hollywood's history, and it's a riot to read. Robey employs both a scalpel and an axe to operate on these celluloid cadavers and runs from D.W. Griffith's Intolerance from 1916 via Orson Welles' magnificent Ambersons to Tom Hooper's much-maligned Cats from 2019. So whether you're part of the small Catwoman litter, Speed 2 maniacs, or just a lover of big egos, ultra hubris and studio mishaps, Tim explores certain box office bombs throughout history and how that conveys through the system of the silver screen, how studio execs bury their heads in the sand, how our movie darlings rise from the ashes or stay burned, and how failure simply fascinates. But rest assured, there's tenderness and lopsided masterpieces too along the way. Let's hear now from Tim Robey.
Yeah, so I had to narrow down the topic somehow because obviously there are many, many, many thousands of films in history that have failed or flopped. One way I narrowed it was Hollywood only. I thought, right, let's do that. Partly because the statistics on box office are available for Hollywood cinema and they're simply not for many other films in other countries. And then I thought, well, you know, some films are considered flops if they get terrible reviews, you know, a low score on Rotten Tomatoes equals flop. But then those films can actually still make money. Something like the Venom series, for example, they still make bank. So I was like, no, I'll narrow it down to the ones that really did lose quite a lot of money. The ones that didn't even come close to breaking even. So the ones where the production budget was a certain level and the worldwide takings were significantly below that. Even before, you know, you start to have to add on the costs of advertising, but even before that, the film is failing to recoup its budget. And I thought these ones, which are actually kind of rare these days, and I found that there was a way to work my way through Hollywood history and choose some that have not been written about too much, which lost a fortune, and explore the reasons why each one of them did.
Well, it's great to have the matrix on show. It's great to show the marginalia, right? And we should say that your book goes from silent movies through the talkies, the golden age of the studios, to the kind of golden age of the auteur, to the Marvel-verse and all the rest of it, the sort of superhero franchises as well. If there is a red thread that goes through the entirety of the book, Tim, is it to do with the opposite of a Midas touch as a director or a producer? Is it to do with mixing big egos and hubris and all the rest of it? Is it simply sometimes the budget is so big, you've got far too vivid colour palette to paint with that you end up producing a monochrome mess, I wonder? Or if there is a red thread, I wonder what is it that runs through?
I would say most of these productions ended up being, for whatever reason, and these reasons are different, too expensive. And sometimes that is because the director was on a power trip and just allowed themselves to get carried away with the budget. I don't do a chapter on Heaven's Gate, but Michael Cimino's Heaven's Gate would be an infamous example of that, for example. Sometimes it's that the producer is the one pushing the budget higher and higher, or yanking the production to the wrong country to shoot in. There are a couple of examples of that, like the Terry Gilliam film Adventures of Baron Munchausen, which they shot in Italy, which cost so much more money than anyone
and everyone hated each other on set, and no one could speak the same language, and exactly, it was awful.
Sort of a disastrous decision. If they'd kept it in Pinewood, maybe they could have kept the budget down a little bit better.
Yeah.
So, but there are all kinds of different reasons why the budget becomes so inflated and so extortionate. One of my favourite films in the book, Babe Pig in the City, George Miller's follow up to the
crazy.
I mean, it's
sequel,
deranged. It's deranged. He'd written and produced the first film, which was an adorable, much loved sleeper hit, but he didn't direct it, and there was creative conflict on that film. So he thought, well, when we do the sequel, I'm taking over and I'm going to make it my way. And it essentially becomes a George Miller kind of like a Mad Max film with a talking pig. But also he gets to make it in Australia, thousands of miles away from the oversight of Universal Pictures in LA, and no one has any idea what he's up to.
Yeah.
So he gets away with this $90 million production, and they have no idea how dark and weird it's getting. I love the film, but it's so perverse. It's almost at the expense of its predecessor. It's almost a rebuke to it.
Yes.
Anyway, so that's an instance where the director's vision just was insane, really.
And we should say that, as you said, there are some very crass films that you mentioned that you detail and chapter in the book. But there's a lot of tenderness in this book. It's clear that there are lovable qualities to almost all the films that you mention and that you profile, and that there are some films that might technically be regarded as flops that you've put in, but you clearly are extolling their virtues and the bravery and intelligence perhaps of the filmmakers, and Charlie Kaufman being a prime example of that with Synecdoche, New York as well. So we start off, as I said, in the silent world in 1916 with D.W. Griffith's Intolerance, he of The Birth of a Nation fame. Tell us a little bit about why you chose this one to start off with, because this could almost be the red thread through your book, some of the themes that happen on this set and with this film. But yeah, give us a bit of a précis of this one.
Yeah, so one of the patterns that does repeat is that a director, or perhaps a producer or whatever, or an actor, has an enormous success, huge. And this was the case with The Birth of a Nation. It was the blockbuster of its day. It was, if you like, the Titanic of its day. The profit was extraordinary. The cultural impact was extraordinary. It was screened in the White House and in the Supreme Court. And I mean, extraordinary. And D.W. Griffith was the king of Hollywood, the king of film production in America right then. And so he thought to himself, I have to outdo this. And it's almost like an Ozymandias syndrome where, the kind of hubris of that idea, yeah. I have to outdo even myself and make something even greater than my previous film.
Look on my mics, look on my works, ye mighty, and cringe.
And cringe, yeah. So he sets about making Intolerance, which is also a film born out of his fury at the people who dared criticize The Birth of a Nation, because it was partly censored. Birth of a Nation was actually censored and boycotted in Ohio and some other states for the obviously racist overtones of the film. And he was furious about this. He thought this was deeply unfair, and he found the backlash unacceptable. So in making a film called Intolerance, he was making a film that was anti-censorship. He was saying, how dare they be intolerant towards my vision, my freedom, my creativity. And the big mistake he made, which is something not particularly repeated much in the rest of the book, is that he threw all of his own money into it. Mm-hmm. What we have seen is that that's just been repeated with Megalopolis by Francis Ford Coppola, but we can perhaps come to that later.
That's our coda, possibly.
Indeed. But he allowed this film to become so unwieldy because he shot a film that was a feature called The Mother and the Law. He screened it, and it was contemporary in its setting, that one, 1915. With Lillian Gish from Birth of a Nation in it. And they screened it in Hollywood, and they said, this isn't big enough. This just isn't big enough. And so he thought to himself, I need to bolt on some more stories onto this. So he ends up telling 4 stories at once and deciding to cross-cut them across a huge swathe of history, essentially, centuries being intercut with other centuries, stories from 4 different time periods, and all of them are meant to be illustrating this overarching theme. But his original cut of the movie...
If ever a film needed a voiceover.
It's 8 hours long, his original cut was.
Yeah.
And he just carried on throwing money at it and going crazy on set and becoming quite tyrannical. And he had these thousands of extras milling around the ancient Babylon set, waiting to be told what to do, being told to jump off battlements during the battle
and
scene.
You get some nice knives in about white elephants.
There's these white elephants that he was insisting on putting up, these huge white elephants on pedestals, and then real elephants have to be brought to the set. No one knew how to handle real elephants on a film set. This was 1915.
Yeah.
And then it was a mix of male and female elephants, and they all just started to hump each other. It was just absolute chaos. People were also really badly injured on this production. There was no health and safety back then. So it was absolute bedlam. His 8-hour cut finally comes forward, and then no one across America wants to screen it. They watch it and go, what are we supposed to do with this? It's 8. No, we're not going to screen it twice, no, we can't.
Yeah.
And so he's forced to cut it down. And that's the first setback he really has in his whole career. Mm-hmm. He's forced to cut it down to like 3.5, 4 hours. And then even then, some critics are impressed. It has spectacle, this film. It's formally really interesting. gets some good reviews, and he thinks maybe I've done it, but then the box office just dies on him, and he's left essentially bankrupt for the rest of his life.
No other art form, cinema, melds art and commerce in an often uncomfortable way. The director, the creative side, and the producer, the money side, to be overly simplistic about it, and that seemed to bear itself out. My idea that this might be some sort of red thread through the book is simply this sees the uncomfortable bedfellows that can be art and commerce, I suppose, born out in this.
I think that's absolutely right, because any one of these productions is being funded by a studio, or except in Griffith's case by himself, but the conflict that can emerge there between what a producer has in mind, or a studio, for the film, and what the director is planning. Fast forward to David Lynch's Dune in 1984.
Yeah.
It's just very clear that Lynch had his wacky ideas for what to do, and Dino De Laurentiis and Raffaella De Laurentiis wanted it to be done their way, and they just, it just never came together.
Why don't we scrap the chronological order?
We'll
scrap your chapter and go straight to Dune. Let's go to Dune, because you use, I think twice in the chapter, a great, very honest quote from David Lynch, who says there was always something wrong with this film.
Yeah.
For a director who obviously has had, as you say, kind of like got the bit between his teeth before, and then after that, you sort of say that he needed to get Dune out of his system somehow. This was a film that obviously had been mooted by various other directors, most interestingly Jodorowsky's Dune, where Jagger would have played Sting's role, and Salvador Dali was in it. An amazing thing. But tell us about Lynch's one. It seems like such a strange film. Did the world just get Star Wars fever, and anything that was a bit like it got a green light? But yeah, tell us a little bit about the Dune syndrome.
It's funny that Dune comes after Star Wars as a film project that got off the ground, because Star Wars is so obviously influenced by Dune as a book. Think of all the kind of sand and the wizards and everything. Yeah. So they tried so hard in the 70s to get Dune off the ground, and no one could make it work. No one could condense the book properly to make it work as a single feature. And that's why we now have it split into two, by Denis Villeneuve. But Dino De Laurentiis has a big go at it, and he's casting around with his daughter Raffaella to find the perfect filmmaker to do it. And they land on David Lynch, who's just done The Elephant Man, which got like 8 Oscar nominations and was very admired and respected film. But The Elephant Man is on a certain sort of chamber scale, and Dune is on a vast scale.
Yeah.
And David Lynch, as a very young man, did not have the experience of wrangling these thousands of extras and so forth that you need to pull that kind of film off. So he kind of stumbles into the production with ideas for the design, which are great. I mean, I love the design of the film, and I think there are many departments on that film who did a beautiful job. The costumes, the sets, some of the music, the photography, a lot of it is really good. But the script is a huge problem. He rewrote it so many times. I think it was like his 8th draft that they finally put on screen. And you can just tell that they're running out of money as he enters the final stretch of the movie. When you watch it, you can see it almost happening. You watch the film fall apart before your eyes. They took it to Mexico. This was a bit like the Italian shoot on Munchausen.
Yes.
A really big mistake. The corruption in Mexico was enormous. They couldn't get anything through customs. The dailies kept being stolen.
Sting had some of his songs stolen from a tape.
Sting had some songs stolen at the airport, literally on his way in. And then there's a really good story with Patrick Stewart there on set, because he's in it for most of the film. And Sting only comes in for 5 days and is complaining constantly about being there. And Patrick Stewart's like, I gather you're in some sort of police band.
There they are. They're there with their helmets and truncheons, singing along to some reggae-infused rock. What could go wrong? It's amazing. And I guess David Lynch is one of the directors that's kind of often regarded as pretty much a genius that you profile in this. And so maybe that takes us on to The Magnificent Ambersons, 1942. Orson Welles, who had such a weird, crazy career. Is this more emblematic of his career and of him than his successes, I wonder?
Well, this is one of the most tragic stories in the book, because I really feel that this could have been his masterpiece. It could have been an even greater film than Citizen Kane. Yeah. And all the omens were actually rather good for that to happen. He has so many of his favourite actors in this literary adaptation. It's a beautifully conceived script. And then it's just a very sad story. He essentially, when he's done with the shoot, he hands the film over to his editor, Robert Wise, and says, right, cut it together. You know the outline. You've got it all. It's all going to be great. You know what I want from the film. I'm going to Rio. I'm going to go and shoot this documentary as my contribution to the war effort. Nelson Rockefeller essentially commissioned this film, and off he goes, and he starts shooting this film called It's All True in Rio, and having a great time in Rio, essentially, for about 2 months. And Robert Wise is trying to cut the film together, and things aren't working. And they're screening it to RKO, and RKO are like, it's very downbeat, it's very slow. They start test screening it. The test screenings go terribly. But they go terribly because of bad planning. They screen the film in this one fateful instance to a bunch of basically teenagers who are off to get their rocks off during the war. And it's on the bottom end of a bill with this kind of frivolous comedy, which everyone wants to just go and have some fun at the movies. And then they stick on The Magnificent Ambersons, all 2 hours 20 of it at that time. It's a very heavy film. It deserves serious kind of admiration, appreciation, and not to be treated like that. And the audience hated it. They just found it completely like grim and unendurable. And so Robert Wise comes away going, this is what we're going to do. And RKO say, well, you just have to cut it down, cut it all the way down. And Orson Welles can't do anything about it. It's too late. The ship has sailed. The film is taken away from him, and it's cut down to 88 minutes, losing
it's tragic,
45 minutes of some of the best stuff in it, some of the final drift of the film. So all we've got really surviving it, which is not nothing at all, is 2/3 of the vision that he wanted to put out there. And it's an extraordinary 2/3, but just imagine what it would have been like if we had all three.
George Amberson Minifer walked homeward slowly through what seemed to be the strange streets of a strange city. For the town was growing and changing. It was heaving up in the middle incredibly. It was spreading incredibly. And as it heaved and spread, it befouled itself and darkened its sky. This was the last walk home.
I wonder, are studios and producers kind of generally warned off whole genres? Westerns kind of made a bit of a comeback in the 90s as kind of slightly more mindful, chin-stroking looks at how the West was won and whether it should have been won in that way and things like this. But I wonder, after having been just gung-ho potboilers, I suppose, for much of their life. I mean, genres obviously go in and out of fashion, but, is that down to individual titles, I wonder?
It can be, and certainly individual filmmakers. I think the Western is a fascinating genre to follow in terms of its peaks and troughs as a bankable genre and kind of like medium, if you like. And what tends to happen is that filmmakers latch onto it and want to make their absolute passion project as a Western. They want to make their 4-hour-long epic. They're going to make the greatest Western ever. They're going for it. And that's what Michael Cimino did with Heaven's Gate.
Yeah.
Again, I don't do a chapter on it because I feel as though the film has been slightly overwritten about in its time. But then that film is such a colossal failure that United Artists are bankrupted and close, and Hollywood doesn't touch Westerns in the first half of the 80s. They just disappear. Instead, they do Star Wars.
Space Westerns.
Space Westerns is what we do. We do Dune, yeah, exactly. We do Star Wars-y stuff. But then the person who brings the Western back, really, as a viable genre is Kevin Costner with Dances with Wolves, which everyone predicted would be a huge flop. They were calling it Kevin's Gate. They were like, he's gone mad. Why is he making this 3.5-hour-long frontier epic? What is going on? But then that film makes loads of money. Clint Eastwood's Unforgiven also does very well, and suddenly the Western is back. Here we go. We can do it again. But then the cycle repeats itself because Kevin Costner goes and makes Wyatt Earp in 1994, which was a big money loser. And there's always you crest and you follow the wave, and then you go back down into the trough again, especially with that genre.
Yeah. Let's spend a couple of minutes on the Kevster because, as you say, Dances with Wolves predicted to be a flop. No one likes Westerns. This is hugely successful. Then he did Waterworld, which you name check a few times in the book because it's kind of one of the most famous, in inverted commas, flops that wasn't.
It's not worth it! You'll never make it with your sales down! Hey!
I mentioned at the beginning that there are films like Synecdoche, New York, which you have a lot of time for, but it'd be nice before we go to really nail a horrible film to the mast. Is that Catwoman? What is the one that is the worst film, or is it Cats?
Catwoman is one of the worst films in the book for sure. I think Cats is almost mesmerizingly bad. I've now seen it 4 times. I kind of can't believe that it exists. Cats has entered a kind of cult camp canon for badness. Catwoman has to a degree, but I couldn't watch that film too often. There's also John McTiernan's remake of Rollerball, which is like profoundly depressing and sent him to jail, quite literally.
Yes.
So that's another
It's a
one.
very good chapter, the one on Rollerball.
It's a bizarre story, that one. But I do think that Catwoman is up there in terms of like the creative mess of it. And also,
I think you did the word you described, the best of your adjectives. Not the best adjective of all time. You just describe it as tacky.
it's so tacky. And also,
Which is joyous, you know.
Warner Brothers were devoting so much care to getting Batman Begins right at the exact same moment that they make Catwoman, and just like they don't care how it looks, how it's cast, what's going on, what the story is. It doesn't make any sense. It's like they just don't care. And as a result of it, and another film called Elektra the next year, female superheroes are not allowed to lead off a film for another 10 years. It's like, nope. We'll leave this to the boys, basically, seems to be the attitude after that.
And you get, and also, I mean, you mentioned this in the chapter on Catwoman. Halle Berry had just come off Monsters Ball. She won the Best Actress Oscar. She was the first black woman to win a Best Actress Oscar. Her star was, well, it already ascended, but she was bankable. She was amazing. And I guess you think of producers and directors fitting particular actors into roles, and the actors themselves thinking this will be a good thing. There is a lot of that in this book. There's a lot of head scratching as well in this book, right?
She's talked into it,
yes.
Halle Berry, for a big paycheck, the biggest paycheck, again, that any black woman in Hollywood would have received at the time, about $13 million. She's sold on the idea, and it's not that they couldn't have made a good Catwoman film, because they tried to earlier. They tried to do one with Michelle Pfeiffer after Batman Returns, and you can conceive of it working. It's just that every single creative choice they made on it was just
tawdry,
really silly and tawdry, and it just ends up being a very embarrassing failure for her and everyone involved. And the director never really got to, pick up a camera ever again.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a killer. That was box office poison, right?
It really was.
That was the stuff. So, Tim, let's come to Synecdoche, New York. Charlie Kaufman's. Is it a masterpiece, is it not? I think it is in your book. It's 2008. And we should say that you list your metrics at the beginning of each chapter. So the budget for this was $20 million and the worldwide gross was $4.5 million. So technically it's a flop, but it had a small budget to begin with. So talk us through this one. He was such a hot property, Charlie Kaufman, still a great genius and great thinker and great writer. But what had he done before that had got Sony to kind of give him this, allow him to make this strange sounding even film?
Yeah, he'd just come off a sort of a triple whammy of very, very acclaimed films, all of which got him Oscar nominated for his screenplays, those being John Malkovich, Adaptation, and Eternal Sunshine of the Spotless Mind, for which he won the Oscar. So he is sort of everyone's favourite writer in Hollywood, and those films are extraordinarily ambitious in different ways and did really well, got the kind of prestige attention and those nominations for the actors and so on. And Sony especially were like happy to keep bankrolling these ideas. But then they came to him for this, and him and Spike Jonze were going to do it. And Spike Jonze went off to make Where the Wild Things Are instead. And the only way that Charlie Kaufman could kind of get it off the ground was by directing it himself.
Each day I'll hand you a scrap of paper. It'll tell you what happened to you that day. You felt a lump in your breast. You looked at your wife and saw a stranger, etc.
Hayden?
What?
When are we going to get an audience in here? It's been 17 years.
All right. I'm not excusing myself from this either. I will have someone play me to delve into the murky, cowardly depths of my lonely, fucked up being.
As you say, $20 million is not that big a budget. It's the lowest budget flop in the book. But I kind of wanted at least one instance of, if you like, an indie flop.
Yeah.
To indicate that proportionally that still is very damaging to someone's career. And Charlie Kaufman does say that film lost so much money that he couldn't get any work after it for quite a long time. It took him years and years to get his next project off the ground, Anomalisa. He had to crowdfund it. And one of the big reasons is, and another reason that I wanted to put Synecdoche in the book, is that the very moment it opened coincided with the financial crisis of 2008 and with one other thing, which was the release of Iron Man. Now, despite the miserable, winter.
I mean, they're almost the same films, aren't they?
Yeah.
When you storyboard it.
The one thing that actually did well at the box office in that autumn and winter was Iron Man. It just absolutely flew off, and no one predicted that.
Is it better to be feared or respected? And I say, is it too much to ask for both? With that in mind, I humbly present the crown jewel of Stark Industries' Freedom Line. It's the first missile system to incorporate our proprietary repulsor technology. They say the best weapon is one you never have to fire. I respectfully disagree. I prefer the weapon you only have to fire once. That's how Dad did it. That's how America does it. And it's worked out pretty well so far.
Iron Man was an obscure character for Marvel to be banking their whole future on, but it just went off to the races. And Charlie Kaufman said, well, as soon as that happened, no one answered the phone to Charlie Kaufman. No one read his scripts anymore. They were just like, we're doing these superhero movies now. And that's what he says. He says the industry just changed instantly, almost overnight, into that mentality. And the kind of films that he wanted to make from that point onwards were much, much harder to make. And Synecdoche is partly to blame because it was so ambitious. I think it's amazing. It's absolutely amazing. But it's also a film about failure. It's a film about having an idea that you can't pull off successfully and have a main character who is just trying so hard to pour his life's work into this one endeavor and not getting it to come off. It's so poignant that the film that Charlie Kaufman made about that was also a terrible
It's very
failure
Kaufmanian, I think,
it's
isn't it?
so meta that
Yeah.
it's untrue that he becomes the main character in the process of making that film, really.
And on set, the crew got stuck in an elevator in the place, and it was all sounded like scenes that could have ended up in the film.
Yeah,
you know?
exactly. Yeah,
And again, not helped. I mean, if certain films have needed if Dune needed a glossary, then maybe you needed at least a picture dictionary for this one, right? Just for the title.
Yeah. Synecdoche needs like a dictionary definition next to it. I mean, some of the other titles in the book, like the Coen brothers film Hudsucker Proxy, I think would have not helped them very much. And also the almost unpronounceable Gigli, which
of
really
course,
tackled, but, yeah.
the Benefer
fiasco of 2003.
It will never be remade for the benefit of all of us. And we mentioned at the beginning of our chat, Tim, that D.W. Griffith had poured all of his own money into Intolerance and kind of bankrupted himself. We speak only a month or so after Francis Ford Coppola's Megalopolis almost didn't raise a ripple in anything other than critic circles, I suppose. What is this? How are we still in the era of the flop, of the huge budget flop with good cast, with all the rest of it, but hubristic ideas, perhaps?
I guess hubristic, but also the big difference there is that Coppola's made this film at the very end of his life, and he's been trying to get it made for 20, 30 years. You know, he wrote it so long ago. And he just thought to himself, I'm going to do it. I'm going to sell my vineyards and I'm going to make this film because I want to. I don't think anyone expected the film to turn a profit. He wouldn't have done. It's almost like, you know, if you want to call it a vanity project, it is that. But it's certainly coming from him. Griffith thought that he was going to keep making huge bank with each one of these films and huge cultural impact, and completely failed there. I think Coppola's failure is more to be expected, if you like, with this film in terms of it not reaching a wide audience. The biggest surprise this year, and it's been quite a floppy year, I'm going to say, 2024, the biggest surprise is Joker, Folie à Deux, just because as soon as people saw it in Venice, they were like, what is this? What relation does it bear to the previous film? What are they thinking? And do they even want the audience to come back for it? And they did not, because people who love Joker just got wind of this being, you know, a Lady Gaga musical with the Joker in it, and weren't interested. And so the film has pitifully failed, and also everyone involved was being paid a lot. Star salaries are another recurring feature in the book. Eddie Murphy's salary, for example, on The Adventures of Pluto Nash, 2002. Eddie Murphy was paid $20 million for that film, which cost about $100 million, and it grossed about $7 million around the world.
Oof, it's awful.
Yeah.
And as you say, I mean, the musical Cats is not without its problems. I mean, Andrew Lloyd, you very amusingly start the chapter about Cats with the Andrew Lloyd Webber, but Steven Spielberg as well on Captain Hook sort of just made it not a musical right at the last minute when they were on set going, I just couldn't handle it. And I just kept on putting production values on to escape the fact that there was this gaping hole in the middle of the film. So it's amazing, as you say, fascinatingly through the book, Tim, that you can get right up to, you know, almost premiere day and not realise that you've got a stinker on your hands, or directors furiously backpedaling, wishing they painted their canvas a different colour entirely, right?
Yeah, or in fact, one of my favourites is Sorcerer, William Friedkin's film from 1977, which in later life he would come to say, I wouldn't touch a frame of it. He was very, very proud of it. And he thought it was a great film, and so did the other people who worked on it. But then when he opened the papers that weekend, when it opened in 1977, the reviews were so damning, and it had the incredibly bad luck to be opening 3 weeks after Star Wars. And the only thing that any cinema in America wanted to be playing at that point was Star Wars, which was just this incredible runaway success story that, again, no one expected. People thought Star Wars was going to be forgotten within weeks.
Yeah.
And it just built and built and built. And the difference there, and that really is a pivotal moment in American films, because it spells the end of, if you like, the kind of grim, gritty, maverick filmmaker era of the 70s, where these dark visions of hell on earth were being allowed to be made. And instead, we're off to a galaxy far, far away, and we're off to follow very easily recognizable heroes and villains on their adventures, and we're off into a world of Indiana Jones and the Star Wars spin-offs and so on, and all of those sequels. And William Friedkin was no part of that. And Sorcerer hurt him deeply. It was, it absolutely died at the box office. It is a great film, though. It's a great film in a completely different mode from Star Wars.
Tim Robey, thank you very much. And Box Office Poison, Hollywood's story in a century of flops, is published by Faber and Faber, and we highly recommend it. Monocle on Culture is produced by Sophie Monaghan-Coombs and Steph Chung-Gu, and Steph edits the show. We'll be back at the same time next week, but until then, from me, Robert Bound, thanks for tuning in.